If you're ticking. It's not a fire. Exactly.
That brings something back.
It's so hard. The way she took it, I wake up and I'm
You just start wearing masks. Look at they.
analyzing.
All right, let's go ahead and get started so we can figure out where we are. If you have not turned in DQ2, please do that before Thursday. I will grade them before class on Thursday. Make sure you do it Wednesday night, I guess, so I can get up early Thursday and do it. We will have a guest speaker coming to class about some occupational opportunities on Thursday. I will also open DQ3, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a sec. That'll be due next Wednesday night as well, so you'll have a full week to do the discussion questions. Our next discussion question is going to be travel writing, so we'll kind of go over that today, and I'll give you an example of it. I did send you over the weekend a piece that I did as the introduction for this collection, and that's going to be our example of DQ4, which is kind of the literary journalism. So, and I'll give you a few other examples of both of those types. So just to give you an idea of where we're going, the next DQs, you're going to really focus on this contrast between the different audiences you'll be addressing in travel writing and literary journalism. So let's get into our case study for today. Talk about local tourism. Talk about the Fitzgeralds up in Montgomery. I'm glad Caitlin is here because she has some direct experience on that as well that she can share with you. But here's what I would want to stress about Montgomery. Montgomery is a very tortured city. It's a kind of a provincial city in the sense that at least up until the past 10 years, it was not welcoming to outsiders. But it did make the modest effort of selling itself very schizophrenically in my mind, with two opposing lures. One is it sold itself as the cradle of the Confederacy. In other words, where the first White House of the traitorous South was located. And I think we have to think a little bit about de-romanticizing the Civil War, but it is a huge piece of tourism. And on the other hand, it's the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. And Montgomery would, for a while, actually advertise itself as the birthplace of the Civil War and the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. So it's very kind of, again, there's a lot of fringe in there that was not acknowledged by the tourism industry in Montgomery. We'll see how that shifted a little bit. Thing I would want to tell you, though, is for all of the history there, and it is really swamped with history, especially in the downtown area, there's not a lot of literary history. And really it boils down to the fact that Zelda Fitzgerald was born there. That's really the only contribution to literary history that Montgomery has. And I would say central Alabama in general. If you go over to Selma, there have been a couple novels about Selma, but I don't know that people really read them beyond civil rights history. And quite honestly, same for Birmingham. So we could even extend that to most of the state and say that, mostly it's hard for literary arts to thrive in Alabama because everybody's interest is in history. That may not be the case with Tom Franklin's stuff, as we'll see when we get into his most famous book of short stories, Poachers, which Aeneas would probably give an 11 out of 10 and categorize as grit lit. Did everybody see Aeneas's review in the Metropolitan of the what's that book again? Knock of Sid.
I love reading her reviews.
They were great reviews. I'm not sure ethically you can give 11 out of 10.
It's my so I can.
That's right. That's like saying we're going to reduce something by 1,000%, but It's okay.
They let me run my own.
I'm teasing you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this literature. Now, here's the further complication. If we're going to focus on Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald as a tourist attraction in the city of Montgomery, some things work in our benefit, some things don't. Here's the major thing that does not work in our benefit. Here's your what's the game show you were just talking about? Jeopardy. Here's your Jeopardy question. What, if you have read anything by F. Scott Fitzgerald, what have you read? The Great Gatsby. Great Gatsby has nothing absolutely to do with Montgomery. There is no connection there, except the scene where Jay Gatsby goes down and meets the Southern girl, which is based on his experience with Zelda, but it does not take place in Montgomery. Does anybody remember where it takes place? He goes to some southern state, city, and meets Daisy Buchanan. Anybody remember where that is? You only have 5 or 6 southern states. Take a guess.
Georgia?
Nope,
Louisiana.
nope,
South Carolina.
nope,
Missouri.
nope.
What?
Missouri.
What do you mean what?
Not Florida.
Not Florida. It was Kentucky.
That's my name.
I almost said Kentucky, but I was like, no, Kentucky's not.
So we've got a double problem here. If people come to Montgomery and they want to learn about the Fitzgeralds, again, you can sell them a copy of The Great Gatsby, but you can't send them anywhere that is mentioned in the book. That's unlike New York City, which I guess we didn't really do any specific.
The boat tour
Yeah, the boat where
was about
you
it.
can get on a boat and go through, the bay that separates East and West Egg, which is actually a pretty cool little trip.
We got to see the house that was like loosely based. And
Yeah, there's some houses. Although I will tell you in New York City or in New York State, there is a big scam among realtors of trying to sell properties that they claim is, inspired something in The Great Gatsby. And then you discover the houses are like only 50 years old or something. So you have to be very careful about that. All right. So here's kind of the main appeal of it. The other problem I would say is this. When we talk about the Fitzgerald's story, we're always selling it as history or as romance. And I think that, not that I'm not a romantic person, but I do think it diminishes the story compared to what we're doing with other literary authors in their place. I mean, we talk about Franz Kafka, it's Kafka versus totalitarianism. Here we're talking Fitzgerald and, oh yeah, they fell in love here, right? So it's a little bit more challenging. So this is how you usually see this portrayed. This comes straight off a NPR description of a documentary they made in the early 2000s. Okay. He came to Montgomery in 1918, where he met and fell in love with an 18-year-old Southern belle. Okay. So the whole idea of coming to the city for love. So if you don't know the story, let's go over it real quick. Basically, Fitzgerald flunked out of Princeton in 1917, did not really have any options, and his whole class basically enlisted in the Army. He was first sent to Kansas, then to Kentucky, which I think is why Gatsby ends up being about Kentucky, then then to Montgomery, where they had just set up a huge Army training camp called Camp Sheridan. And one of the things I would want you to know is when Camp Sheridan opened up and all the soldiers came, it effectively doubled the size of the city. Montgomery at that time was a city of about 25,000 people or 40,000 people. And they sent about 40,000 troops down here. So it would be like, what's the population of Troy? 10,000? It'd be like we had all of a sudden 10,000 more people in the city from places that none of us have ever been. Okay, so it changed the character of the city. His division was sent back up to New York in October 1918. They were literally getting on the boat when an outbreak of influenza, or what they kind of racistly called Spanish flu back in the day, broke out, and it stopped his deployment. And that became kind of the major disappointment in his life, was he never made it abroad to experience the Great War. He had all these kind of weird ideas that he would get over there, probably be killed in the war. That would be his great romantic ending. He had tried to write his first novel while in these camps, and had actually sent off a draft to a publisher at the time they were supposed to go over there. So he had all these kind of romantic fantasies about being a great literary hero posthumously. Now, how serious he was about that, I don't know. Here's a little clue if you ever want to do anything, though, kind of North Montgomery or even going up to Wetumpka. There is a story from 1936 that very few people know called I Didn't Get Over. I didn't get over is a phrase that military people who did not make it to the Great War would say to each other. And so he was not alone in this. But it's a very interesting story about an accident that happened in a military camp where a group of soldiers almost died trying to cross probably the Tallapoosa River, I guess it would be. And again, the opportunities are here because nobody's really ever done anything locally with this story. So if you're thinking of a dramatization, I've always thought that there's a bazillion theater companies in Montgomery and Millbrook and Wetumpka. They've never adapted it or done anything with it. So there's a great opportunity there. Might make the subject of a great podcast. Who knows? Okay. But it's just something, this is kind of the angle we want to go for, something we don't know about. Here's what we can say about Zelda. She was born here at the turn of the century, graduated from the local high school in 1918. That building is still around. It is now a junior high magnet school. So there's not a lot of buildings left, but there are a few. She was known for dancing and painting, known as kind of a firebrand. Now, this is what's kind of interesting. I want to tell you the story of this. Wasn't widely known until probably about 13 years ago. She actually started writing fiction before she ever met Fitzgerald. So we were talking about literary discoveries last week. There is a story called The Iceberg, and here's how this came to be. In 2013, we were planning a conference in Montgomery. And at the time, there was an independent bookstore. It's down by Huntington College. It's basically where the Huntington College bookstore is today, if you know Montgomery. I went in there one day and we're talking about this conference coming up. And the guy that owned it said to me, "Hey, let me show you something." So he goes in back and he comes back with a yearbook from 1918 because his grandfather had been in the same graduating class as Zelda. Wasn't really a yearbook. It was like a little literary magazine, kind of like their version of the Rubicon. Now, one thing you will discover, everybody's grandfather in Montgomery went to school with Zelda. I mean, I've had so many people tell me that. So my BS meter was kind of flickering in a little bit. But he opens this literary journal up, and there is a short story in there by Zelda that I've never heard of before, called The Iceberg. And this would have been published 3 or 4 months before she ever met Fitzgerald. So I kind of ran home. Well, first off, I scanned the story, but I ran home and looked at every single biography, every single text I could find, got online, went through the archives up at Princeton, could not find anything referencing The Iceberg. I'd never heard of it. So we ended up taking that scan and sticking it on the back of the program of the conference as a way of saying, there's still stuff out there to be found that nobody knows about. Well, lo and behold, one of the Fitzgerald's granddaughters, 2 of the Fitzgerald granddaughters, one that was on our cruise, came to this conference and she had never heard of it. And I said, well, this guy just gave me this copy and, it's never been copyrighted. Don't know what to do with it. We just decided it'd be kind of a neat thing to tell people about. So lo and behold, and I mean, this is literally, that conference was in November 2013. About 1 month later, there you can see the school. 1 month later, I open up the New Yorker. The family had sent the story to the New Yorker and said, we just discovered a short story by Zelda that has never been published. Now, I want to show you how this works. The story was recently unearthed. They apparently left out the prepositional phrase by, so my shot at literary fame went down in flames. But the point is that this gave us another angle on Zelda. It had been sitting there in some guy's literary yearbook for ever. Never known about. Now, is it a great story? No. Is it interesting? Yes. I mean, it has relevance to stuff she would later write about. And a couple stories that are actually set in Montgomery too. So the idea here is if you want to be a literary detective, you really need to go to the place where the story either begins or ends and find places outside of the library to try to dig around. That was probably a once in a lifetime find. I don't have any other expectations that I'll go anywhere else and discover anything. But it's just kind of a neat adventure to have. Let me tell you about a couple things you might think about here in Troy that I've always encouraged people to research. Down on the Troy Square, there used to be a pharmacy, and the family that owned it had a child back in the late 20s. They ended up leaving Montgomery because it was the Great Depression. But that kid who was born here in Troy ended up becoming a relatively such a famous writer. I forget his name, so I have to look it up. But he was of a generation, the same generation as Cormac McCarthy, actually. They were spoken of early on in the same breath before McCarthy got super famous. But his name was Jesse Hill Ford. Yeah, Jesse Hill Ford. And he ended up writing one of the big novels of the 60s. Nothing's ever been done on his kind of Troy roots or his family or anything like that. He would go on to become sort of notorious. Here's a great true crime podcast in the making. 1971, he's up in Tennessee. Somebody parks in his driveway for whatever reason. I mean, they had some issues in the family with the house being harassed. He shot at the car and ended up killing a soldier, a black soldier that was sitting in his driveway. There's the real twist. The soldier was in a car with a teenage girl. And he ended up going on trial, and it was a big event in 1971, but it's virtually forgotten today. So there's all kinds of Southern racial issues you could explore. And a lot of it unfolded a lot of the things that his novel was about, the racism in this town. So there's stories out there that haven't been told yet. Another one, if you go over to Jackson, Mississippi, there is a study center over there for a writer named Margaret Walker, who wrote before Toni Morrison, before the novel Roots from the 70s. She wrote one of the great Southern sort of Black migration novels called Jubilee. And there's a section of it that is set right outside of Troy. And again, it's never been really discussed. I don't know that there's a whole lot there, but it's an interesting connection locally to the things that we could explore, forgotten things. So that's kind of what we're looking for, forgotten things. All right. Okay. So there's Camp Sheridan, what it looked like at the time. This is all kind of North Montgomery. They actually had one of the things that happened during the pandemic is there was a lot of questions about Fitzgerald and whether he ever got, every writer who ever lived, somebody was asking in 2020, did they ever get the Spanish flu? Because of the pandemic, people were looking for that kind of connection. So a lot of people uncovered some stuff about the influenza breaking out at Camp Sheridan. I don't think Fitzgerald had it mildly, but I think he got it up in New York. Here's the problem with doing anything with Camp Sheridan today, right? This is, you can see where in Montgomery is, kind of little North Montgomery right above the zoo. This is what's left. Yeah. They have one marker and like one cannon, right? And it's in the middle of a busy medium. What's that?
It's got turned into housing.
Did it? I haven't been up there, so I didn't know that.
Same place, I think.
Okay. I haven't been up there in probably 3 years, so I should probably go check that out. But that said, we brought people down here and back in the 90s. That's what we would do. That's what we had to do to show them. We could take them out to this thing. So there wasn't a lot to do, but that was very early on type of Montgomery tourism. Okay. So there are stories that you can go through. There are 3 stories that are set in Montgomery. He calls it Harleton, and he moves it over to Georgia. But those 3 are in this collection. The best of them, which is one of his best stories, is called Last of the Bells. And there are certain sites that are mentioned in here that did exist in Montgomery. The prison, there was a horse racing, what do they call it? Horse track. All of these things are gone, though. Nothing really much exists 100 years later. Even if you go downtown Montgomery, you can find references to the hotel that was sort of the huge center point of downtown Montgomery. It was right by Court Square. What does that say it was called? The Exchange? Yeah, the Exchange. So you see in all sorts of newspaper stuff at the time, that Zelda performed there. That was basically where all, upper crust Montgomery had their social life. Well, that was torn down in the 70s. There was a second version of it, but it was torn. The second version was torn back down in the 70s. And again, this is kind of what it looks like today. So there's nothing very uninteresting. Now, the Court Square Fountain, and this is a landmark that shows up in a couple of Fitzgerald pieces. So this is some history to talk about. In 1850, Court Square Fountain was the richest slave market in the South. The slave market was more profitable in 1850 than in either New Orleans or in Charleston. Now, didn't hold that distinction for very long, but one of the things that happened, and it was sort of in one of these pages over here, there was a brokerage that was established by some Jewish brothers named Lehman. And eventually the family moved up to New York. That became one of the huge brokerage places or financial places. It was the bankruptcy of the Lehman brothers in 2008. See, this is all, you guys were barely born then. But for those of us who are older, we remember this. That's what caused the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. It's when Lehman Brothers went over and the economy crashed. I mean, people literally thought it was the Great Depression too. So there's a play called The Lehman Cycle, I believe it is, that was on Broadway, won several awards, and sort of explores this whole history of how these financiers made their money off of slavery and then helped crash the economy almost 200 years later. So that's a little bit of notoriety about it. Now you'll see that's during Black Lives Matter during 2020. I can guarantee you, if we get the governor in that's threatening to be governor, even though he lives in Florida, they're going to erase all that. But it's important to understand that this history, when I first moved to Montgomery, was unacknowledged. And a lot of the history of slavery. There was maybe one sign downtown. Now you go down and you can see some. It wasn't the city that did that, as we'll see. The other thing I would tell you about the fountain, and this kind of gets a little weird how you don't want to ruin people's idea of history. If you know anything about Scott and Zelda when they were in their wildest, you will always see the phrase when they were, at their wackiest early in their marriage, that they jumped into fountains. So I can't tell you how many women I've met in Montgomery who said, "Oh, I jumped into that fountain just like Zelda did." And I don't want to ruin it, but if I did, I would say, well, that wasn't the fountain that she jumped in. The one she jumped in was all the way up in New York City at the park, what is it?
Central Plaza.
The Plaza Hotel, yeah. So it's interesting how these stories kind of get juxtaposed. People want to have more concrete stories about the Fitzgeralds in Montgomery than honestly there really ever are. Okay. So this is just a way of saying a lot of this history is just very abstract. That brings us to this place, which is the Fitzgerald Museum. Hopefully Caitlin doesn't start having PTSD here. But this is probably at this point one of the most famous house museums in the country, if for nothing else than it has survived for almost 40 years. It was founded in 1987, opened to the public in 1989. They lived in this house only a very brief period in 1931 and 32. This was after she had a nervous breakdown and spent a year and a half in a sanitarium in Switzerland. So they moved back here at a very fragile point in their lives and their marriage. And then basically because she had another breakdown, they had to go up to the hospital up in Baltimore. This remains, after all these years, the only place the Fitzgeralds ever lived that is open to the public. So it is a pretty big destination for Fitzgerald fans. I will tell you that in the 25 years I was on the board of this institution, from 1994 to 2019, and we'll tell the story of why I left. This was the mom and poppiest of any place I have ever worked for. Okay, and you will often find this in author museums. It was owned by a local attorney and his wife. The staff there usually was never more than one or two people. They actually rented out 3/4 of it. For many years, these two apartments were rented, and this was rented over here. So we really only had this space over here. And there was never, for most of those years, a kind of coherent narrative. You just kind of walked in and here were some books, and here were some mementos, and here were some pictures, very few of which were original. They had a few paintings, but mostly what this was open for was a way of saving the house from being torn down and having like condominiums put up or something. That was actually the plan. The thing that limited the museum for many years is there was a neighbor off to the right, I believe he has since passed away, named James Fuller, who the minute they announced they were going to open this, sued and claimed that the neighborhood, because this is a very, stuck up sort of, I shouldn't say stuck up because Professor Lewis just moved into this neighborhood. Yeah, he lives a couple blocks north. But this is a kind of Tony part of old Montgomery, and so they didn't like the idea of businesses in this neighborhood. They did not want it commercialized. Now that's changed a lot, but I knew people in the 90s who wanted to open bed and breakfasts in this neighborhood. What changed it was the rise of Airbnbs, because then you didn't need zoning. Anybody could rent out their house for Airbnbs. So the limitations on the museum really kept it small and semi-professional for a long, long time. Now the connections, there are some famous connections. This is probably the most famous picture of Zelda Fitzgerald. It was taken as the author photo for her only novel she ever did, which was called Save Me the Waltz. That's why she's wearing a tutu. If you know her story, she tried to be a ballerina at the advanced age of about 25 or 26 and was told you're way too old. And that sort of exacerbated her mental breakdown. But it's a very interesting experimental novel, avant-garde novel, I would say. But it was mainly always read as a document of her mental illness. But as I like to tell people, when I was a docent there, what we would do is we would show people this photo, you really can't see it here, but I say, look at the floor and look at the floor you're standing on. Because it would be taken in that exact same room. There's Save Me the Waltz, the cover of it. So that was probably the biggest sort of claim to fame that you could have in the house. And in fact, this is the other version of the photo. You can see clearly here that these are their trunks sent from Europe when they came back. And it has their address on this Felder Street right here. And they even reproduce it on the cover of this very famous biography of her. So, you know, theoretically, people who know anything about Zelda have heard of this house. They might even know the address from this book cover. So you've got a lot of potential here to attract people. One of the things we did that I did, that I gave the museum, that they ended up, that they still use today, is when we had that conference back in 2013, I took that photo and had it colorized and had it blown up into one of those kind of cardboard things so people could get their picture taken to it. Now, after the conference, for probably 3 or 4 years, I stored it in my Montgomery office till one day the cleaning lady said, "Do you mind getting rid of that? Because every time I walk in the room and turn on the light, I think somebody's in here." So we took it down to the Welcome Center for a while. After a while, they didn't want it. Finally said to the museum, "Do you want this?" You know, it was maybe $300 to make. And now it's one of the first things you do when you go visit the museum. It gives people something to do. You can walk in there and get your picture taken with Zelda. And that's kind of your greeting as you go there. All right. So the thing the museum is probably most famous for, and this was our big innovation, is starting in 1995, we began holding once a year a gala. Because we discovered that anytime you mention the Great Gatsby, what's the first word you think of? The first thing you think of?
Party.
Parties. Great Gatsby is the greatest American novel about partying. There's a couple partying scenes. Everybody wants to go to a Gatsby party. So we began hosting Gatsby parties. I helped run them probably all the way up until probably, I think the last one I was really involved in was probably 2019. So that's 25 years of. You can even see here, oh, look who worked at one of those.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm so glad you.
Very good. You got to be the cigarette girl, I believe.
That was it.
Remember right. And you really want to laugh. See, I'll make more fun of
I was about to
myself.
say, where's your?
Where's your touch?
So this is
Yeah,
exactly
there it is.
30 years ago this month. 1996. So you can see how cruel time has been. All right. Now, this is kind of one of the things I want you to understand is we talk about the difference between travel writing and literary journalism. In literary journalism, you always want to look for the knot of conflict, the ambiguity, the moral ambiguity. All right. So we began throwing these parties at a time where Montgomery was not really receptive to parties, but also not really receptive to the Fitzgeralds. The museum had a lot of lawsuits that trying to shut it down, keep it from having a lot of tourists come. They certainly did not want people to have big parties on this property because it's in the middle of a residential area. So right away, one of the things we had to do was face the fact that Montgomery, you know, was a small-minded town and did not see the value of having the Fitzgeralds there. It was also a generational thing because when I first moved to Montgomery, it still had the vestiges of what I would call debutante culture. The class differences between the old money, which mainly lived in this area, and young people was huge. When I moved to Montgomery at the age of 28, there was nobody my age there. Very few people. I remember meeting a friend of mine, and who's a good friend of mine now, but he's still a bartender, but he was a bartender back then. But I remember the first time I ever met him, and I said, "Where's everybody in their late 20s in this town?" Because there was nobody. And he said, I was like, did a generation go to war and get murdered and I didn't know about it? And he basically said that the people who graduated college and left could, because there was nothing in Montgomery to do for people who were under, say, 50. And that was true for a long time in Montgomery, probably for 15 years. It was a city that was dominated by older people and again by old money. They did not want these kinds of tourism things going on. So we faced a lot of issues just having events there and promoting anything in the city. Now, there's even a broader issue that has to do with the question of throwing Gatsby parties. Personally, when I started doing this, I had come straight out of grad school where we threw keggers about every weekend. So I knew a thing or two about throwing parties. But and it was huge. I mean, that was kind of a release valve. Um, but the difficulty of throwing a Gatsby party, let me say this, Gatsby parties really didn't exist until the 70s. And they started happening because there was a movie version of it made with Robert Redford, where it wasn't a great movie. It made money, but it wasn't a huge hit. But one of the things that happened was that was one of the first movies that was a merchandising bonanza where they sold a bunch of garbage to go along with the movie. So, for example, Brooks Brothers had a whole line of suits men could go get that were like Gatsby suits. I mean, they had Gatsby salt shakers. They had all, just every bit of like junk bric-a-brac you could imagine they produced for that movie. So one of the things people started recognizing was that people, the formality or the elegance of the Gatsby parties in the novel became something that people could use as a theme for fundraisers. So you really never see mention of a Gatsby party being thrown before about 1974. After that, you see everybody and their brother throwing Gatsby parties, right? And they're usually for some kind of fundraiser because it gives people an opportunity to do what? Dress up. You get to get into a flapper outfit, right? Or for men, you get to wear a suit. So the first ones of these we threw where people started dressing up, we discovered that especially young people really liked the idea. They hadn't even read The Great Gatsby, but they liked the idea of coming to a party and dressing up. The other thing they liked was the idea that it was about alcohol. And it's true. We would get bartenders to have custom drinks, make their mixologists. When that took off, come and sell, here, come and taste the Zelda and I don't know what, some green potion, smoke rolling out of it. People loved it, right? That's part of the 20s experience as well. Here's the problem with this. I had done probably 18 years of Gatsby parties. And then the Baz Luhrmann movie came out in 2013. Has anybody seen that? A lot of people really dislike that adaptation because it's very brash and loud and it's got Jay-Z music in it. And personally, the Redford one that they made in the 70s is kind of a snooze fest. But there was everything for a while in 2013 was Gatsby. Everybody was talking about Gatsby. And then one day I get up and I look in Atlantic Monthly, which I like to read, and there's this article. The sublime cluelessness of throwing Gatsby parties. And I thought, wow, what have I been guilty of for 18 years? The whole thesis of this article is kind of summed up in that subtitle. The book is meant to condemn decadence, not to celebrate. My first thought was, dude, do you have to pee on my parade? Can I not have a damn party once a year? But there's a legitimate argument there. And this is one of the things that people always forget about Gatsby, that even though those party scenes are fun, it really is satirizing and therefore critiquing the sort of extravagance, but also the decadence. You go into those chapters And there's a lot of drunk people. Right? There's one guy that has a car accident trying to get out of the house. So the question becomes then, are we celebrating the very thing that the novel critiques? Now, on one level, when I want to have a drink, that moral contradiction does not bother me at all. When I have a drink, when I want to see some pretty ladies in flapper outfits, I can put my morals aside. Right? But from a theoretical perspective, it's something that we ought to grapple with. Okay? And I will tell you that there were certain times at those parties where people probably got a little out of hand. And we had to be very careful because when you throw a party like that with any kind of alcohol, one of the first things you have to do is buy insurance. So you can't just open the doors. You've got to be covered on all this kind of stuff. You know, throwing a party is a lot of work. Here's what else sort of gets you to think about this. Couple things that have happened in 2025. I was at an event up in Princeton talking about, it was right around the time Gatsby turned 100. And there was an author there who had done the book. Her name's Maureen Corrigan. She's a book reviewer for NPR. But she did the appreciation book on Gatsby that I showed, Why Gatsby Mattered. And we were talking about the party scenes, and I was being a little flippant. I have a joke that I always tell about throwing Gatsby parties or getting invited to them. Because the other things I used to get invited to them a lot too. People would say, you know, we're throwing this down in Florida. We'd love for somebody in the museum come down. We'll comp you $100 ticket. Oh, I'll drive for a party for that. So my joke was always, I get invited to Gatsby parties all the time. Nobody's ever invited me to a Grapes of Wrath party. What did I do? Put on my best overalls and, right, sit on the hay bale, right? And again, you're being flippant, but it makes the point almost to the Great Gatsby's disfavor. All right. So Maureen was talking and she compared the Gatsby party, those scenes to, how many of you have ever read Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death? Anybody want to summarize that story very quickly? What's the point of that story? Anybody? Anybody remember?
I think in middle school. I think.
So it's the whole idea that during the plague, there are people that are in the castle that are the hoity-toits that are throwing this big gala, thinking they're protected from all the infected people outside. And it's that image of the people that are kept out that she was commenting on. That's kind of what the Gatsby party was, because we don't, guess who we don't see at the Gatsby party? We don't see all the waiters, all the staff, all the people that put the party together, all the people that are doing the service industry work, right? It's almost as if all of the labor that goes into throwing those parties is completely rendered invisible by our ability, and this is the great theme of those parties, is the wastage that we produce at a party. Just think in mind of the term, this may not be as relevant as a term to you guys, but when I was growing up, everybody wanted to get wasted. Let's get wasted. What are you doing this weekend? The answer was not, I think I'll read a book. The answer was, let's get wasted. The pleasure of destroying brain cells or getting out of bounds or going nuts, that was the purpose of those parties. And that conspicuous wastage, the using up of resources, is exactly what those parties celebrate. So that's kind of the point that this article is making. You throw a Gatsby party, you're guilty of doing what the novel condemns. Now, again, I think it's perfectly fine if every once in a while, once a year or so, Lord knows we need some diversion, that we get dressed up and we pretend. All right? Now, fast forward, I'm going to give you an exact date. November 1st, 2025. It's the day after Halloween. It's a Saturday. get up early and I'm thinking, got some time to do some work around the house. And all of a sudden, my phone was blown up. I had a bazillion messages. Why? What happened Halloween night? This is what happened Halloween night. Down at Mar-a-Lago, which is kind of a tacky Gatsby mansion, right? Somebody decided, this was when the government was shut down, and most importantly, the next morning, November 1st, SNAP benefits were going to be cut off. And he threw a great Gatsby party. My phone, I had all kinds of messages. Would you comment? Because, Fitzgerald Society. Would you guys comment on Trump throwing a great Gatsby party? I don't really want to. I got major Trump fatigue. I was kind of like, couldn't he have thrown a mice and men party? It's Jane Austen's 250th birthday, right? Couldn't they do a book that really ends in the death of everybody? Like the Death Star blows up? Couldn't they do a Star Wars party? Right? So we had to sit down and strategize. What do we want to say? And again, this is at a time, I don't think people would be worried about this now because, the environment has changed a little bit. But back in November, people were nervous about their jobs. Keep in mind, this was only a couple months after people were getting fired for making Charlie Kirk comments that were not necessarily bad things, but nobody wanted to call attention to themselves. So we had to be very careful about how we put this out there. But we did let it slip. I really doubt he's ever read The Great Gatsby. It's gonna take a wild guess. But you know what? 99% of people who go to Great Gatsby parties have never read The Great Gatsby. Maybe they've done it in high school. So this is the disconnect. This is what we're talking about. Who's our audience? The point of those Gatsby galas was to fund the museum for about a year. On a good year, we might make $15,000. A bad year, we might only make $5,000. But that gave the organization enough of a lump sum that it could, keep the lights on if the numbers weren't coming through. The reality is that institution only survived because of the man that founded it. By the way, the man that founded it died last spring, and we were at the Gatsby Gala with several of last year's students. And somebody told me he had passed away that day. So it was a very surreal experience, and it only adds to the weirdness of these Gatsby parties. So my point is if you ever go to the authors that are most associated with parties, there's two of them, and actually Jane Austen is probably a little more popular. Maybe not in this country, but if you go over to England, they are always throwing Jane Austen parties, and people love to dress up in the Regency era stuff and whatever the dance is, whatever the 1800 version of twerking is that they're doing.
What is that, Lynn?
They call that a reel dance or whatever. It's the line reel or something like that. That's their escape. But those parties aren't really controversial because it's not celebrating the lavishness of it or the eliteness of it. One of the things you discover in Montgomery, if you say to an African American person, would you like to come to this Gatsby party? They're probably going to be very uncomfortable. It's not a Harlem Renaissance party, right? They're going to be very aware of what these parties represent. So one of the things Fitzgerald scholars have always struggled with is how do we make Great Gatsby relevant despite the fact that it's not a novel about race, that Fitzgerald was on the wrong side of race, That's a tough, really moral issue to address. All right. So let's talk a little bit about sites that are associated with some of the stories that can be kind of interesting to look at. And I do this because this is the kind of material that you would have to gather and collect if you're going to do a travel log or travel writing. So for example, the first story takes place in 1920. It's called The Ice Palace. It was one of his breakthrough stories. It's basically a very autobiographical story. He came down to Montgomery and there's a whole legend about how she threw him over. He went home and wrote the great American novel, and when he got it accepted, he came down to Montgomery and said, now I'm rich and famous and we can get married. And she said, okay. So this is a story about a northerner coming down to the south, and they go to a very famous graveyard that's there in Montgomery called Oakwood Cemetery. It's older than the city itself. Very famous, lots of Civil War stuff in there. So now a lot of the stories also involve the house that Zelda was raised in. And this is a little further south of downtown, but in an area that when I first moved to Montgomery, nobody dared to go to. Now it's been very much rehabbed, called Cottage Hill. The problem with it, there's a very famous picture of her sitting out in her mother's rose garden in that the summer after she had dumped him. And there he is sitting on the steps, right? You can find in these stories descriptions of that very house. All right. So wouldn't it be a cool thing to be able to go to the house where F. Scott Fitzgerald courted Zelda? And by the way, had to compete with a bazillion soldiers who were also after her. Well, just one problem. There she is again. There they are in the backyard of that house, right? So you can find all kinds of references to it. In this area, the church where Zelda was raised in is still there, where her mother was an organist. It's a community center now. So you can go there. There's their daughter outside the house in the 1970s, about a month before it was torn down. That's the back of the house 50 years ago. So this house is gone. You can go to Pleasant Avenue, which is an address that everybody knows who's a Fitzgerald fan. And what do you see? You see an empty lot, a big blasted patch of ground.
Are the steps still there?
Well, there's a couple houses where the steps are still around that you can see what it would have looked like. There's still a couple houses standing, but I do think the steps are still there. But now there's actually a lot of argument over which exactly plot it is. The woman that runs the museum disagrees with me, and I could be wrong. I don't know. But the main thing is there's nothing to see there. You drive down the street and there's nothing there to see. All of the bricks were saved and they're kind of put up at the museum. But the only thing you're going to do when you go there is look at dead grass. Right? There's also a story called The Jelly Bean, which takes place at the Montgomery Country Club at the time, which is a fun story. It's about gambling. It's about women drinking too much, about men protecting women. It's a very popular story at the time. This is what the Montgomery Country Club looked like at the time. Pretty nice place, right? The interior of it, that's what it looks like today. That's the second one that they built that's still standing. Doesn't look like a fancy place on the inside, right? But you can go into this story and find, descriptions of what it will look like. Here's the problem. This is what it looks like today. It is literally a Sonic hamburger stand. This street right here is called, actually the street behind it is called Country Club Avenue. Guess you could go to Sonic and roll up and say, hey, did you know there's a Fitzgerald story that takes place on this exact spot? But I don't think they're going to give you a discount. All right.
Now, what is the street in front of it?
Carter Hill.
Okay.
This is right right before you get to Cloverdale.
Mhm.
So this was right before you would turn left into Cloverdale. So there's just literally nothing there. Now you can go to the cemetery. And when Kate was a student in this class, we had a field trip up there. If y'all want to take a field trip to Montgomery, we can do that some weekend. That's what it still looks like. Okay, so you can go in there and there's a scene in there where they walk among these graves. These are graves of the Confederate soldiers, many of them anonymous. It's on a beautiful part of the cemetery. There's just one problem. You know what they do at the cemetery in the short story? They go there and they make out. It's a big lead up. There's this big roll up about, oh, the South has been lost and so much of our culture is gone. And you realize it's basically a way for them to have a big tonsil hockey scene, right? They just make out. So it's meant to be irreverent. So what do? You put up a kissing booth here? I don't think so. Right? It kind of mocks all the reverence that we associate with Southern cemeteries. There's also another problem. This is the most famous cemetery in Oakwood Cemetery. You know who this belongs to? Hank Williams. We'll do in our dark tourism thing, the whole, why do we go to cemeteries of famous people? We kind of broached on that a little bit with Kafka. But for many years, if you came here to see Hank Williams and his wife, Hank Jr.'s dad, people would literally come here with 6 packs of beer, drink them, and put the bottles on his gravesite for a guy who died of alcoholism in the back of a Cadillac, which is also in Montgomery. So, yeah, open top, I think an open top Cadillac. So I think it's a Cadillac. I could be wrong. Anyway, it's a Hank Williams death car. You can go see it in Montgomery, not far from here. This is one of the big tourism draws, and actually their family came in and said, we don't want people drinking here anymore. It really got to be disrespectful. Zelda's parents are also buried here in this part of it, but it's very difficult to find. A couple years ago when I lost all credibility I have because there was a podcaster, a producer who came down and I was like, oh, I'll go show you Zelda's parents' grave, and I couldn't find it. In part because there was a big tree that they cut down that was kind of my guide to it. But you can go there. But again, what are you going to do while you're here? Right? Oh, there's her parents' eternal resting spot. It does show up in Save Me the Waltz, but it's not going to take you there. Last of the Bells, probably the best of these stories. Part of it references Taylor Field, which was a aviation fighter training camp. There's a scene in the story where, and this sounds a little silly, but one of the pilots that is courting the Zelda character commits suicide in his plane because she rejects him, which is that they always claimed that was true, but I have my doubts, right? Now you can go out here and you can find, and I actually live right around the corner from here, you can find the what they call this commemorative plaque for it, but there's nothing there, right? It pretty much looks like that today. It's all kind of overgrown rural stuff. They reference a swimming pool. There's a scene where they go swimming. This was in a park it was called Oak Park, and it is shut down as well. The swimming pool was closed up in the 1950s because the city fathers decided that when they were ordered to desegregate Oak Park, they would rather fill in the swimming pool than allow black and white people to swim together. So again, not a lot of great history you're able to share with people. This is not a triumphant narrative. All right. I will tell you a story that about 2 weeks after I got my job with Troy back in 1993, many decades ago, I got a call one day that the chair of the English department on the Montgomery campus had been arrested in Oak Park. What do you think somebody would be arrested in Oak Park for doing? Anybody want to take a guess? And they ask you look like you want to take a guess. It's probably a scene in Knock 'em Stiff, to be honest. He got arrested for mail solicitation. This park had become a cruising ground because, that was a time where people were not out. So, again, and there's been shootings in this park and all kinds of things. It's basically kind of abandoned at this point. Troy actually ran its planetarium here for years, but even they got out of that business. Now, here's stuff you can do. You can go down to the state capitol, which Zelda, played around, and there are some references to it. There's Jefferson Davis becoming the president of the South. So there's a lot of Southern history. Right here at the state capitol, I was just here the other night for a memorial for a nurse that was shot in Minneapolis. But if you go right here is Martin Luther King's church. So that juxtaposition is really the heart and soul of tourism in Montgomery. Civil rights versus Civil War. How do we fit the Fitzgeralds into this? They were not civil rights advocates. So therefore, we have a tough time kind of making sense of it. There is a great piece of undiscovered literature from the early 70s in which the great poet Gwendolyn Brooks was sent down to Montgomery to write journalism in poetry. It's an interesting piece. And she was sent down with a photographer named Moneta Sleet, who was the first Black man to win a Pulitzer Prize. She was the first Black woman to win one. She won one before him. He was the first man to win a Pulitzer Prize because he took the very famous picture of Martin Luther King's wife and his youngest daughter at Martin Luther King's funeral in 1968. This piece appeared in Ebony magazine. It's a great portrait of Montgomery in the early 70s. And it captures sort of the post-Martin Luther King despair of where does the civil rights movement go now? But nobody's done anything with it. So that's an opportunity there. Now, here's where Montgomery tourism really takes off. And it's only happened in the last 10 years, really 8 years. In 2018, there's a group called the Equal Justice Initiative that opened up two sites in Montgomery. One is called colloquially known as the Lynching Memorial. Okay, it's actually called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This is one of the most profoundly affecting historical sites or commemorative sites that you can ever go to because of the way that it's done. And we'll show you the historical juxtaposition here. But if you've anybody ever been to this? You have? Describe it a little bit for us.
Yeah, like it's very open. I don't know, you just walk through like between the.
How did you feel when you went through it?
Yeah, it's really quiet.
Yeah, it's very contemplative. It's overpowering because what you do is you walk into basically you are walking under columns that are arranged alphabetically by the name of counties, not by states. And on those columns are engraved the names of victims of lynching year after year after year. There's about 3,000 names there, I believe. Okay, so it goes from the 18th century all the way up until about 1948 or 1949. It's a very powerful experience because one of the things that happens is as you go in, it sinks down and you realize at some point that you are in the experience of looking up just as you would if you were at an actual lynching. So it creates in you the discomfort of being at a lynching without representing bodies, but just giving you the names. Now, one of the things I used to like to do is take people here and we would go find the inspiration for fictional characters that are hung in like Faulkner or novels like that, Southern novels like that. And there's a few of those you can find in there. There's also a legacy museum that's that's a little bit further into downtown that is very important because it makes the point that mass incarceration as a form of slavery. There have been a lot of documentaries about this lately. It's a great experience to go through. They've opened, actually, just in the past year, opened up a sculpture garden a little further north of the city, where you can take a boat from the boat launch, the infamous site of the Montgomery boat brawl a couple years ago, if you remember that. But you can ride up the river to this, or you can drive there. And it's more representational art. But what it did was, this is the main thing I would want to emphasize, except for the years of the pandemic, uh, these sites brought in 3/4 to 1 million visitors, 750,000 to 1 million visitors to Montgomery every year. Totally changed the nature of the city and its attitude toward tourism. And it also directly affected the Fitzgerald Museum, because the smartest thing they ever did was they quit renting space to as apartments and turned them into Airbnbs. So the Airbnb, the two upstairs Airbnbs, you can go and have the Scott and Zelda experience. They've got the rooms set up as they were in the 20s, right? And you get to go and be in the heart of the area the Fitzgeralds were in. And you go do this kind of tourism all day. Those things are booked enough that that's what keeps the museum going now. All right. So again, that's great for the travel story. It represents a problem about how do you connect the Fitzgeralds to these sites. That's what the experience is, looking at it as you walk through. All right. And then there's some sculpture there. I would love to go on a Saturday if y'all can get away and we could meet up there and then take y'all to lunch. Because it really is a powerful experience and we can show you some of the sites down around there. The thing I would want you to remember is this is the map. This is the site itself. Actually, my old office in Montgomery, I still have one, is right here, so it's very close by. Here's the Fitzgerald house. So you can stand in this corner, look over the wall, and see up the street where the house was. So it basically abuts Pleasant Avenue. And again, there's no connection there. So here's the other neat thing, is when you come out of the Legacy Memorial, you're given a quote from Toni Morrison. Does anybody know where this quote comes from?
Beloved.
Beloved. All right. This is a speech from Baby Suggs, supposed to be in the voice of a black preacher. It's a very interesting experience to stand there and watch white people read this and realize this, we are not the ones that are being addressed by this. We are the they. Okay. But I think that's an important thing for us to experience, to understand that one of the things we can't do with these sites is universalize it. We can't, and pardon me for saying this, we can't Anne Frank it. Right? We can't say, I believe that people are ultimately good or whatever that is. That always makes it more sentimental. This is a very different kind of experience that they give us from this. So I love the fact that they use Toni Morrison. And the fact that, again, it's not Martin Luther King. It's not a historical figure. It comes out of a novel. And that's an important thing for us to understand. Literature has a memorial purpose. That's why we see the last passage of The Great Gatsby quoted in all kinds of public rhetoric. It means something. Okay? All right. Here's a good example of when that first opened, the memorial. The New York Times. The museum had been trying to get a story in the New York Times for 25 years. They started sending journalists down, and this is kind of what you're going to do. What would you do if you have 36 hours in Montgomery, Alabama? What tourism things would you do? Well, now this restaurant is gone, by the way. But start at this restaurant, go to the Fitzgerald Museum, right? Get a little description of it. That's your travel log. This is what you're going to do for your author in your city for discussion question 3. I'm going to give you an example today, and I'll have links to a couple other examples in module 4 for Thursday. All right. Some of you may know Anna Shea Wasden, who was a graduate of our program. Caitlin knows her very well because she and 2 other girls had to share a bed on a trip we all took to Italy. But that's Anna Shea. But she has produced, when she took this class, did a Fitzgerald walking tour and subsequently ended up putting it online. So I'm going to give you all copies of this. And this is a great guide for you as you think about what travel journalism is like. Anna Shea is now one of our adjuncts, and she spent the first 2 or 3 years after she graduated living in Europe and teaching, doing a lot of travel. Probably the first 4 or 5 years now that I think about it. I mean, quite a bit. I want to remind you that when both Caitlin and Anna Shea had first graduated, they had not really been out of the country. The first time you took a plane ride was when we went to Italy. So the kind of travel stuff really does change your life. So she goes through and she finds 10 spots around town that you can go and visit. Now here's the big problem with Montgomery. It's not a walking city. In a lot of cities, you can do this kind of stuff as a walking tour. I can do everything I want to see of Kafka's except the grave on my own feet. I got to take an Uber out to the cemetery, but everything else I can walk to. She's got it online, and I'll put the link in the module as well, but printed off copy for you. Now, a couple years after she published this, there's actually a woman that works at the museum that wrote her own book. And this is a kind of publication you guys could do for your author. This is an actual book that was published. It's basically a tour guide to the Fitzgerald in Montgomery. And she takes you through all the parts of town, tells you all the history you need to know about the cemetery, about the house, about all of this. Makes a lot of really interesting connections to it. So this would ultimately be, if you're a travel writer, it could be one of your goals. There are tons of books like this, like Walks in Hemingway's Paris, or over in Andalusia, Flannery O'Connor. Just about every big site, place you go to, somebody is selling a literary travel Andalusia. I think it's Andalusia, Georgia.
Oh,
I
Georgia.
thought you
It's over your face, I was like, no.
It's in East Georgia,
That makes
where the Flannery
No,
The
that's
other
what
one?
I'm saying.
Flannery O'Connor houses. But there's a lot of Flannery
Actually, it's
O'Connor in
it's
Georgia.
like-
So basically, any writer that's associated with a space like this, you could do one of these travel books. And then, they're not, this is not literature. This isn't a tourism guide. And, you might spend $10-12 on it, but it's an interesting sort of piece of reporting. All right. So I want to come back to the literary journalism. And again, I want to emphasize the difference between the two in the 2 minutes we have left. If you're writing a travel log, you have to imagine yourself travel journalism. You are essentially working for the place. You're encouraging people to come there and see whatever there is. You're selling. You're selling the positivity of it. Okay? When we're doing the literary journalism, we want to focus on the contradictions. Okay? So when I went to write this introduction, I was really hesitant to do it because I really didn't know what to say about these stories. To me, it's very difficult to read 3 stories set in Montgomery in 1920 in this era of segregation when all of this violence is going on in the South. And these are sort of light, frivolous stories about young people falling in love. There are N-words throughout the stories that are not critiqued. This is not Faulkner protesting anything. These are stories that accept the status quo. One of the things I discovered in doing the research was around the same time, this would be September 1919. Keep in mind, this was all happening about the centennial of that time. This is 2019 when I was researching all this. One of the things I discovered, this is a year after the lynching memorial opened, I was looking at what lynchings had occurred in, in Montgomery and discovered that in, I believe it was August, 1 month before Fitzgerald came roaring down here to tell Zelda he had gotten his first novel accepted, and this was going to be the great start to their love story. There had been 3 lynchings in Montgomery within the space of about 10 days. Nobody knew anything about those people. What could be found had been documented there, and then I thought, that's my hook right there. The juxtaposition of the Fitzgeralds in Montgomery, never mentioning these lynchings, never talking about them. That's my sort of moral knot right there. So at the risk of sounding sort of self-important, I want to read just the ending of this introduction because this is really what I want to push you guys for. I ended talking about the opening of this lynching memorial and how if you stand in that back corner of the memorial and look over the wall, you can look right up into, get my glasses to do this, but give me just 1 second. Go over second part.
You could have, and you
You
chose not
I
to.
have that much faith in myself reading it aloud. I'm not.
All right. It's a little long of a paragraph, but I want you to kind of feel the sort of moral contradiction we want to go for here. The only thing connecting the lynching memorial to Pleasant Avenue is an intervening strip of east-west asphalt called Mildred Street. Although the road isn't abnormally wide, stand on either side, and the gulf between these two places, only 50 yards apart, seems insurmountable. There just feels like no honest way to bridge the gap between unimaginable black suffering and delicate white poignancy, between historical crime and literary beauty, between Toni Morrison and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yet, as F. Scott Fitzgerald himself once wrote, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function, which is a great quote. Too often we want to reconcile incongruous chapters of history, forcing the pieces to fit to convince ourselves we can solve the puzzle and make it whole. Contrast can be as illuminating as unity, though. It reminds us that the friction generated along the border between 2 incompatible things prevents us from oversimplifying the stories we tell. And if the story of Zelda's hometown deserves anything, it's not to have its contradictions artificially resolved. All of the bells gather 3 stories of the South that don't mention the things the South is most famous for. Fitzgerald's Tarleton tales are about entitled young women bucking against convention and discovering that new freedoms perhaps aren't so free. Until some ambitious creative writer produces an epic tale that somehow synthesizes black and white history of central Alabama, the trio of these 3 stories will stand as the best, most polished fiction about Montgomery, a city that few creative writers have ever had the courage to take on, precisely because its history is so momentous. Because the stories are key to appreciating how thoroughly Zelda fascinated her husband, giving his imagination focus and shape, they demonstrate that Fitzgerald understood the South by understanding her. Toward the end of his life, he remembered the desperation he felt trying to prove his art was the ticket to their shared yearning for extraordinary lives. And this is a beautiful passage. And since this is coming up to Valentine's Day, I want you two to take special note of this. Ian and Tommy, this is great. You can win over any chick you want with this. I was in love with a whirlwind, and I must spin a net big enough to catch it out of my head, he wrote. The head full of trickling nickels and sliding dimes, the incessant music box of the poor. So reading these three stories in sequence shows that he didn't have to cast that net wide to spin it rich. So the idea again, you've got this juxtaposition. That's what we want to go for when we do DQ4 for the literary journalist. What we'll do for next week is more of a travel guide to get us into a more sort of extensive kind of writing. I'll have some examples available for you on Thursday. You'll have about a week for that one and then a week for the literary journalist. So be thinking about the site of your author and what contradictions there you can juxtapose your writer against. Anybody have any questions?
So when did you leave?
What's that?
When did you leave the Fitzgerald board?
Oh, well, if you want to stick around and hear the story of why I left the museum board, I'll tell it real quick, but we are out of time. You want to hear you want to hear the tea? All right. Without naming any names.
Oh.
So one of the things I always tell people, this is a struggle you'll have if you go into arts administration. In arts administration, you can be the administrator, but you're probably not going to get to be the artist. So we had a wonderful person, good friend of mine, who was the executive director of the museum at that time. And she was always, I felt she was very young when she took the job. I felt like the board kind of infantilized her a lot. But we're coming up on Valentine's Day. And without asking the board, she decided that she was gonna have a thing there where people could come and, are y'all familiar with this phenomenon of boudoir photos? Now, I've heard there's something called boudoir photos.
Oh, yeah.
I'm getting into that. She decided that she was gonna charge people who wanted to do it to come to the museum and take boudoir photos. Which, technically, I don't think anybody would have really objected. The problem was she posted pictures of herself modeling. Yeah. So I was just sitting there one day and all of a sudden, I don't know why everybody calls me on this. The phone was blowing up and literally one of the, someone who's big in that world who used to actually work at Troy texted me and said, "You've got to get her to take those down now." I'm like, why is this my job? But I will tell you that in Montgomery, that flipped at least that area, the old money crowd out. And the lawyer that had founded the museum, now I thought this was a little pissy. One of the neighbors came with an anonymous note and stuck it in his mailbox. "You've got to understand what's going on at this house. People are wearing underwear and taking pictures of themselves in it." It was a huge mistake on her part. She ended up leaving of her own accord. I think the board would have simply, taken it as a lesson. Nobody wanted to punish her. But again, it's an issue of professionalism. And sometimes those are just the tough things that you have to learn. I mean, one of the things last fall that happened immediately after all the Charlie Kirk stuff was I told faculty, people are losing their jobs over posting stuff. I normally wouldn't say this, but this environment, they're looking for sacrificial lambs. Don't post anything. And I got some blowback from faculty on that. Well, freedom of speech. That's fine. We'll all have our chance to have our freedom of speech back. Right? We can go to the FICE thing that they let us have. That's our freedom of speech. But you gotta be willing to know when to roll the dice and don't. So again, professionalism is a huge thing. And oftentimes in the arts, you will find yourself in organizations that are not professional. There are going to be a lot of kind of wacky people. I can tell you here at Troy for many years, we dealt with an artist who's famous for painting genitalia. It shocks me, male genitalia. It shocks me that we were ever in cahoots with that guy, because there were literally people who had to work over in the what I call it, fundraising or whatever. Miss Owen could probably tell you some stories, although we aren't gonna ask her, where they didn't want to be alone with the guy, because he was just weird. I'll just end on this note. That same spring, they had a reception. They gave him an award. And, I mean, he was a very flamboyant gay man who just didn't care. He gets up there and he literally accepts this award and he says, I'd like to thank the university because very special to my mama who was here. She was the biggest whore in Pike County.
Oh.
You could hear a pin drop. And everybody just sat there. What'd you think?
Get that on the flash. Biggest whore in Pike County.
Everybody just sat there and pretended they didn't hear that.
Amazing.
And went right on.
God,
I mean, the chancellor was right there.
Oh.
So-
my
That is insane.
So these are just things you deal with, but that was the right thing to ignore it. And
Yeah.
when she had her issue, the right thing would have just take down the pictures. Let's all forget that this happened. So just be aware of your professional behavior. We'll have guests on Thursday talking a little bit about this with some opportunities that you might have to do some traveling. All right. Happy birthday.
Thank you. Did y'all get a cookie?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks. If you have any questions about what we're doing, please let me know. Please do take a copy of this handout, because I want you to have it as we work on our travel log.
I'm so glad you published this online. I didn't know that she had.
It's been on, I mean, she never even told me about it. I just happened to find it when I was Googling stuff one day. But yeah, it's